Imagine a sound capable of instantly drowning out the noise of the Pacific surf and the ecstatic cries of seagulls over the Santa Monica Pier. It is not a gunshot, and not a clap of thunder, but the dry, sickening crack of splitting wood, resembling the groan of a dying ship. If you had found yourself on the famous Muscle Beach on that scorching afternoon of July 1967, this sound would have made you freeze with half-eaten ice cream in your hand, because it emanated from the center of a dense crowd, where the air vibrated with the smell of coconut tanning oil, cheap testosterone, and aggressive male ego. In the epicenter of this human circle, behind a rough picnic table dug into the sand, sat a creature that seemed not a human, but a genetic experiment crossing a buffalo with an asphalt paver. The locals called him Tank, 120 kilograms of steroid rage, a mountain of tanned meat with biceps wider than the heads of most spectators. Tank had just slammed the hand of yet another hapless tourist into the tabletop with such force that the wood under his elbow buckled, and now he was roaring with delight, enjoying his status as the king of this sandbox. You probably think this is a story about a big guy bullying little ones, and the police are about to show up? That would be logical, but the reality of that day prepared a script that even the craziest Hollywood playwright couldn't have written. Through the crowd of onlookers, parting not out of respect, but out of bewilderment, a man approached the table who looked like a statistical error against the backdrop of Tank. It was Bruce Lee. But forget the movie star image. At that moment, in his simple tank top and sunglasses, he seemed like a teenager who had accidentally wandered into the territory of grown men. His weight was exactly half that of the champion. His wrist seemed like a fragile twig next to the log of Tank's forearm. The crowd fell silent, expecting the giant to chase the upstart away with a kick, but instead, a tension hung in the air that was heavier than the barbells in the open-air gym. Tank stopped laughing. Slowly, with the grace of a fed crocodile, he turned his massive head toward Bruce and bared his teeth. "Are you lost, boy?" he growled, and spittle flew across the table. "The sandbox for kids is over there. Here we break bones, not build castles." This was the moment when any normal person would apologize and leave, saving their limbs. But here the very Santa Barbara effect comes into force, causing your brain to stall from cognitive dissonance. Bruce Lee did not leave. He did not get scared. He didn't even take off his glasses. He made a move that was so mundane and calm that it was more frightening than any threat. He slowly sat down on the bench opposite the monster. But the strangest thing wasn't that he accepted the challenge. The strangest, most frightening, and inexplicable thing lay in the object Bruce held in his left hand, and which he now neatly, with surgical precision, placed on the table. This is our plot dagger, a sweating, icy glass bottle of Coke. Look at it, in your imagination. Drops of condensation slowly run down the cold glass, gathering in a puddle on the hot wood. Bruce placed it, not just anywhere, but exactly 5 centimeters from the spot where his own elbow would be during the match. Why? What is the point? The spectators exchanged glances, twirling fingers at their temples. They thought the guy just wanted a drink before being destroyed. But Tank, that experienced street fighter, suddenly felt a prick of anxiety. He realized that this bottle was not a drink. It was a timer. It was a level. It was a challenge. Bruce Lee looked at the giant through the dark lenses of his glasses and uttered a phrase that sounded quieter than the noise of the surf. But for Tank, it was louder than a gunshot. If this bottle falls, you win. If it stays standing, you leave here knowing that your muscles are just water. Ask yourself honestly, how confident do you have to be to set a condition where any, even a microscopic tremor of the hand, any vibration of the table from the opponent's monstrous pressure would mean defeat? Bruce Lee voluntarily drove himself into a framework where he didn't have the right to even a millimeter of error. Tank turned purple. His neck swelled, turning into an oak trunk. Veins on his forehead bulged. pulsing with a rush of adrenaline. He perceived this not as sporting interest, but as a personal, deadly insult. He decided not just to win, he decided to destroy this upstart's arm, to slam it into the table with such force that the bottle nearby would shatter into smithereens from the shockwave. The giant slammed his elbow onto the table with a swing, and the wood creaked pitifully. He opened his huge, sweaty palm, inviting Bruce into the trap. Bruce slowly, unhurriedly, placed his hand into this meat clamp. The contrast was monstrous. Bruce's hand disappeared in Tank's fist, like a child's palm in a father's hand. The crowd held its breath. Everyone was looking not at the wrestlers' faces. Everyone was looking at the bottle of Coke. It stood so close to the epicenter of the future storm that it seemed it should fall simply from the tension in the air. Tank took a breath, preparing for a jerk that was supposed to tear Bruce's arm from his shoulder, but he didn't know that at this moment he was holding not a human hand, but the lever of a mechanism whose operating principle was beyond his understanding. He thought he was fighting flesh, but in reality, he was preparing to engage in battle with pure physics. And he lost this battle even before the command "Go" sounded. In that fraction of a second, when the agreed signal to start the duel, a sharp shout of "Go!" from someone in the crowd cut through the hot air of Santa Monica Beach. Tank didn't just start pushing, he exploded. Imagine a hydraulic press turned onto full power to flatten a car into a cube of metal. That is the monstrous, primal force the giant put into his first movement. His plan was simple and brutal. He didn't intend to play tactics or endurance. He wanted to hear the crunch of Bruce Lee's joints in the very first second, to imprint the back of his hand into the wood of the table so deep that splinters would pierce the skin. The muscles on Tank's arm swelled, turning into the knotted roots of an ancient oak. The veins on his neck tightened like anchor chains, and his face instantly filled with dark crimson blood from the strain. The table under their elbows let out a drawn-out, agonizing groan. The wood began to deform, and the spectators instinctively leaned forward, expecting to see the little Chinese guy's arm break under this onslaught like a dry branch under a truck wheel. But it was at this moment, when physics dictated the inevitable defeat of the lesser mass, that a glitch occurred in reality, that very Santa Barbara effect that makes you doubt what you see with your own eyes. Bruce Lee's arm did not move. It did not flinch. It did not tilt a single millimeter. It froze in space as if cast from titanium and welded to an invisible axis passing through the center of the earth. Tank pushed with force, capable of flipping a small car. He leaned in with the full weight of his torso. He growled through clenched teeth, but he wasn't pushing a person. He was pushing a wall. And the scariest thing for his psyche wasn't that he couldn't move the opponent's arm, but what he felt by touch. Under his fingers, he felt not a tense bicep ready to burst, but a strange, frightening softness hiding the density of steel. Bruce wasn't resisting in the usual sense of the word. He was absorbing Tank's energy, grounding it through his elbow, through the table, straight into the sand under his feet, turning the monstrous pressure into nothing. Ask yourself honestly, what happens in the head of a man who is used to being the strongest in the room when he meets a force he cannot explain? In Tank's eyes, flooded with sweat, madness began to dawn. He couldn't believe that this teenager was holding him. He decided that Bruce was using some trick, that he was simply enduring with his last bit of strength and was about to break. Tank doubled his efforts. He began to jerk his arm, trying to shake the defense loose. He broke the rules by leaning in with his shoulder. He used dirty street arm wrestling moves, trying to twist Bruce's wrist. The spectators saw the table shaking, the table legs digging into the sand under the pressure of this struggle. It seemed that the furniture itself was about to fall apart. But look at our dagger, at that very sweating bottle of Coke, standing 5 centimeters from the epicenter of this earthquake. This is the detail that blows the mind. The table vibrated, the wood creaked, Tank convulsed with tension, but the liquid inside the bottle remained frighteningly calm. It barely trembled. How is this possible? Bruce Lee isolated the tension. His arm was stone, but the rest of his body was relaxed. He didn't transmit the vibration of the struggle to the table surface. He dampened it inside himself. It was an intellectual orgasm of biomechanics. While Tank spent 100% of his energy, burning oxygen and clogging muscles with lactic acid, Bruce used exactly as much effort as was needed to hold the angle, and not a gram more. And then Bruce did what finally destroyed the giant's psyche. He didn't counterattack. He didn't growl back. He slowly, demonstratively turned his head away from the table. He looked at the ocean, at the seagulls circling over the water, and his face expressed absolute, deadly boredom. Then he yawned. It wasn't a fake yawn. It was the yawn of a man waiting for a bus. For Tank, this was a blow below the belt, more painful than any fracture. He, the beach champion, was squeezing the life out of himself. His heart was beating at 180 beats per minute. The capillaries in his eyes were bursting from pressure, and his opponent was bored. Tank felt not just weak, he felt invisible. His strength, his status, his ego, all of this crashed against Bruce Lee's indifference. The giant began to panic. His breathing faltered, turning into the wheeze of a driven horse. He realized he was in a trap. He couldn't push Bruce's arm down, but he couldn't let go either, because that would mean public disgrace. He was locked in this static hell where time worked against him, sucking out strength with every second, while Bruce Lee seemed able to sit like that until sunset without even breaking a sweat. And at that moment, when Tank was on the verge of physical and emotional collapse, Bruce slowly returned his gaze to the opponent's face, and there was no longer boredom in his eyes. There lit up the cold fire of a surgeon ready to end the operation with one sharp movement of the scalpel, but waiting for the patient to finally realize the hopelessness of his situation. 20 seconds passed, but for Tank, whose muscle fibers were tearing from overexertion, releasing toxic doses of lactic acid, this time stretched into a geological epoch of suffering, where every millisecond was filled with the agony of powerlessness. The bulging vein on his temple pulsed with such a frantic, arrhythmic rhythm that it seemed about to burst, splattering blood on the table boards, and his face took on the color of raw meat, turning into the dangerous blue of hypoxia. He tried everything. He changed angles of attack. He tried to lean with his weight. He even tried to secretly use his other hand, bracing it against the edge of the table for leverage, violating every conceivable rule of a fair fight. But Bruce Lee's arm remained an absolute constant in this equation of chaos, a fixed point in the universe that refused to obey the laws of brute force. The spectators surrounding the table in a tight ring stopped chewing and whispering. That very visual silence reigned on the beach when the collective mind of the crowd suddenly realizes that the collapse of an unshakable myth is happening before their eyes. They looked at the mountain of muscle that trembled and sweated, trying to move the arm of a man who weighed half as much, and in their eyes, fear was replaced by awe-struck horror at the nature of this invisible force. Ask yourself, what does a king feel when his crown is ripped off along with his head, but it is done slowly, enjoying the process? Tank felt his authority, which he had built for years by intimidating newcomers and breaking tourists' arms, evaporating like water on hot asphalt. He looked at Bruce, and in his pain-clouded gaze, a plea could be read. Give up, fall, let me win. I'm bigger than you. But Bruce Lee didn't look at him. He continued to look at the horizon, and this indifference was more destructive than any punch to the jaw. However, if you looked closer, you would notice that, under the mask of boredom, titanic work was happening inside Bruce, invisible to the amateur eye. He didn't just hold his arm, he used the structure of his skeleton, building a perfect geometric figure where every joint, from pinky to heel, was part of a single chain diverting Tank's monstrous energy into the ground. It wasn't a battle of muscle against muscle. It was a battle of construction against chaos, and construction was winning. And here we return again to our dagger, to that very bottle of Coke, standing in dangerous proximity to the epicenter of the fight. The condensation from its sides had already run down onto the table, forming a small puddle, but the bottle itself stood as if glued down. The table under the wrestler's elbows groaned and buckled. The sand under the table legs subsided, but the bottle didn't budge. It was physical proof that Bruce Lee completely controlled the vibration. If he had turned on brute force for even a second, if he had started fighting on Tank's terms, the table would have shaken and the bottle would have fallen. But its stillness screamed that Bruce was absorbing energy, not reflecting it. Tank, whose gaze fell for a second on this cursed drink, suddenly realized that this bottle was his tombstone. It stood like a monument to his defeat even before his hand touched the table. At this moment, when Tank was already on the verge of physical collapse, when his lungs burned with fire and capillaries began to burst in his eyes, Bruce Lee decided the lesson had dragged on. He slowly, very slowly turned his head and looked straight into the giant's bloodshot eyes. There was no longer boredom in that look. A cold, sharp light lit up there, like the glint of a blade being drawn from a scabbard. "Are you done?" Bruce asked, and his voice was calm, even, without a single note of shortness of breath. This question sounded like a point-blank shot. Tank wanted to answer, wanted to roar a curse, but he had no air. He could only wheeze. And then Bruce did what finally broke the bodybuilder's psyche. He slightly, by a millimeter, unclenched his fingers, allowing Tank to feel a false hope, to feel the arm yielding. Tank, gathering the last crumbs of strength, jerked downward, thinking victory was close, but it was a trap. Bruce used this jerk to seize the initiative. He instantly changed the vector of force, switching from passive absorption to active attack. It was that very Santa Barbara effect, when the victim becomes the hunter in a split second. Bruce didn't just start pushing. He engaged an explosion, an impulse born in his legs, passed through his back, and shot into his forearm. In Tank's eyes was reflected the horror of a man who realized he was holding not a hand, but a detonator, and that the timer had just reached 0. In the instant, the trap set by Bruce Lee snapped shut with the clang of a steel bear trap, and Tank, deceived by the false sensation of yielding, jerked his arm down, putting the remnants of his life into this movement. The laws of physics on Santa Monica Beach ceased to operate in the usual sense. Do you expect to see a struggle? Do you expect their hands to hang in the center of the table, trembling with tension? You are mistaken. An explosion occurred. The impulse Bruce generated from his heel through his hip and back passed through his forearm with the speed of an electric discharge, meeting the inertia of the falling giant and turning it 180 degrees. A sound rang out that made the seagulls over the pier soar into the sky in panic. It wasn't the thud of flesh on wood, but a dry, deafening shot, like a sledgehammer hitting a coffin lid. Bam! Tank's arm, carried by the monstrous force he himself had generated, slammed into the tabletop with such speed that the eye couldn't track the trajectory. A second ago it was up, and now it lay pinned to the wood, and the tabletop beneath it cracked. Tank howled, but it wasn't a cry of pain from a broken arm, although the sound of the impact suggested exactly that. It was the howl of a man whose brain split in two from the impossibility of what was happening. He recoiled from the table, clutching his throbbing red wrist to his chest, and in his eyes, dilated to the limit, splashed that very primal horror experienced by a predator that has suddenly become prey. He looked at his arm, checking if the bones were intact, and then shifted his gaze to Bruce, expecting to see triumph, gloating, at least some human emotion that would explain this phenomenon. But here the very Santa Barbara effect comes into force, breaking the viewer's psyche completely. Bruce Lee didn't even change his pose. He didn't jump up. He didn't throw his hands up in a victory gesture. He remained seated, and his breathing was as even and calm as a man who had just turned a page of a book. The crowd around the table, which just a minute ago was ready to carry Tank on their hands, now froze in deathly silence. They saw not just the defeat of a champion, they saw David destroy Goliath without even breaking a sweat. And in this vacuum silence, Bruce Lee made a move that became the final control shot to the bodybuilder's ego. He slowly reached out his left hand to our plot dagger, to that very sweating bottle of Coke that had survived this earthquake without moving a millimeter. Look at this gesture. Bruce grasped the cold glass, lifted the bottle, and took a long, refreshing sip. The sound of the gulp in the silence of the beach sounded louder than any scream. It was a demonstration of total, humiliating control. While Tank was dying from overload, Bruce just wanted a drink. Ask yourself honestly, what does a person feel who has dedicated his life to building his body when he is shown that his body is just a decoration? Tank stood breathing heavily, and sweat streamed down his face, mixing with a grimace of shame. He realized he lost not because he was weaker, but because he was empty. Bruce tore himself away from the bottle, wiped his lips with the back of his hand, and looking up at the trembling mountain of muscle, uttered words that became the epitaph for the cult of bodybuilding that day. "Muscles are just meat," he said quietly, but every word was driven into the consciousness of those present like a nail. "You are big as a wardrobe, but you are empty inside. Strength does not live in the volume of the bicep. It lives in the tendons and in the ability to control emptiness. You tried to crush me with weight, and I just allowed your strength to pass through me and return to you like a boomerang." It was a moment of intellectual orgasm for everyone watching the scene. All the puzzle pieces fell into place. People understood why Bruce was so calm, why he yawned, why the bottle didn't fall. He wasn't fighting Tank. He used Tank as a tool to demonstrate the laws of physics. The giant, who 5 minutes ago was the king of the beach, now looked like an inflatable doll let down. He silently turned around, hiding his eyes, and began to make his way through the crowd, which parted before him no longer out of fear, but out of squeamish pity. He walked away carrying whole bones, but crushed pride, knowing that tomorrow he wouldn't be able to return to this gym because the ghost of the little Chinese guy, with the bottle of Coke, would haunt him in every mirror reflection. Bruce Lee remained sitting at the table, alone, surrounded by an aura of untouchability, and when he looked at the ocean again, there was no joy of victory in his gaze. There was only the tired wisdom of a master who once again proved that appearance is deceptive, and true strength always remains invisible until the moment of impact. But what exactly did Bruce see in the crowd the second Tank disappeared from view? And why did his face suddenly become serious, as if he realized this lesson wasn't for the giant, but for someone else watching the scene from the shadows? The answer to this question is ready to slip off the tongue, but it requires silence, because true secrets always whisper. When Bruce Lee, adjusting his sunglasses, which hid eyes that saw the essence of things right through, stood up from the table and dissolved into the motley, noisy crowd of Santa Monica tourists, something strange happened on Muscle Beach. Something that can be called a collective hangover from reality. You probably think that after such humiliation, the local king, Tank, should have either thrown himself into the ocean out of shame or started training with doubled force to get revenge. That would be the classic ending of a sports drama where the hero falls to rise again. But life writes scripts with ink that doesn't wash off so easily. Tank didn't return to training. Witnesses say he sat on the sand until sunset, staring at his huge, useless arms, and in his head, the temple he had been building for decades was collapsing. He realized his body was not a fortress, but a prison, a decorative facade behind which there was nothing but water and air. That day marked the end of his career on the beach because every time he approached the weights, he remembered not the heaviness of iron, but the lightness with which his hand was pinned to the table, and this phantom thud was louder than any clanging of barbell plates. But let's return to our dagger, to that very empty glass bottle of Coke that remained standing on the table as a monument to the unknown soldier in the war of physics against ego. Look at it. It warmed up in the sun. The condensation dried, leaving only cloudy streaks, but it still stood there, unshakable and whole. This bottle became a symbol that true strength leaves no traces of destruction on the one who wields it. Bruce Lee didn't just win an arm wrestling match, he left a message encrypted in glass. If he had used brute force, the bottle would have fallen from the vibration, but it stood. This meant that mastery is the control of chaos, the ability to be in the center of a hurricane and not spill a drop. However, looking at the modern world, we must admit a bitter truth. Humanity did not learn this lesson. We ignored Bruce's message. Here, the final, global Santa Barbara effect triggers, which concerns each of us. Despite the fact that Bruce Lee proved the superiority of function over form, the world chose Tank's path, not the dragon's path. Look at modern gyms, magazine covers, Instagram feeds. We still worship volume. We inject synthol. We take hormones. We want to appear bigger, wider, scarier. We build facade muscles that look beautiful in the mirror, but cannot save us in a real critical situation. Bruce Lee won that day on the beach, but he lost the war for the minds of future generations because it is easier for people to pump up a bicep than to strengthen the spirit and tendons. We chose a beautiful lie over a difficult truth, and that bottle of Coke, forgotten on the table, became a tombstone for common sense. And now, as we stand on the ruins of this philosophical dispute, I want to pass this metaphorical bottle into your hands and ask a question that will force you to reconsider your priorities. Imagine that tomorrow, the end of the world comes, rules disappear, and you need to survive. Whom will you choose as your avatar? Do you want to be the bodybuilder, a mountain of muscle weighing 120 kilograms, who can lift a car, but whose heart will stop from hypoxia after 2 minutes of a real fight, and whose ligaments will snap under an unnatural angle? Or will you choose the path of the master, a wiry man unnoticed in the crowd, whose strength is invisible to the eye, but whose structure is stronger than titanium, and who can neutralize a threat with one movement of the wrist without even spilling his drink? Whose side are you on in this eternal battle? On the side of mass, which scares with appearance, or on the side of structure, which kills with efficiency? Who was Bruce Lee to you in this story? An arrogant magician who humiliated a simple guy, or a prophet who tried to open our eyes to the fact that we are chasing dummies? Write one word in the comments: mass or structure. I will wait for your choice, because it determines who you really are. One who wants to seem strong, or one who wants to be it, even if no one notices until the very moment your hand touches the table.